do feel it, that strange, persistent static in your spiritual life when you know you were praying, you redeclaring scripture, you are doing all the right things, yet the heaviness refuses to lift. The breakthrough feels perpetually out of reach, and it's as if your words, though fervent, are absorbed by some dense, invisible fog before they ever reach the heavens. You are not failing. You are not lacking faith. You are likely encountering a sophisticated, specialized form of spiritual counterintelligence. And your primary weapon, while potent, is being met with a targeted defense. My name is Cain Thorne. For 22 years, I worked in a division so niche that most within the broad hierarchy of darkness only knew of us by rumor. We were the Department of Acoustic and Atmospheric Interference. Our sole focus was not on your sins, your past, or even your doctrinal disputes. Our entire operational mandate was to analyze, map, and neutralize the spiritual output of believers, specifically the sounds you make in faith. We created elaborate schematics of spiritual warfare tactics, and we discovered a consistent, exploitable pattern. Most believers default to petition. They come to the spiritual realm with a list of needs, a series of arguments, a case to be pleaded, and we were ready. We understood the courtroom. We could dispatch agents to oppose, to accuse, to delay, to bring contradictory evidence against your petitions. A battlefield of wills is a terrain we know well, but there was another sound, a different frequency of communication that consistently bypassed all. Our defenses scrambled our surveillance and forced a full-scale retreat of operatives from a zone. That sound was not a prayer request. It was the raw, unadulterated sound of worship, not performance, not religious routine. I'm talking about the conscious, willful decision of a human spirit to ignore, to present evidence of circumstance, and directly ascribe supreme worth to the person of God himself. When that sound reached a certain threshold of authenticity, when it became what your own scriptures called a sacrifice of praise, it did. Just ask for change. It enacted a change in the very spiritual atmosphere that our operations depended on. I read the after-action reports. I saw the terminology, atmospheric realignment, critical frequency breach, agent disorientation. The most chilling was the simple designation, acoustic hazard, zone compromised. I'm here to tell you that the most potent weapon in your arsenal, the one we feared above many others, is not your pleading prayer, but your proclaiming worship. Prayer often focuses on the problem in the presence of God. Worship focuses on God in the presence of the problem. And that shift in focus does just change your perspective. It changes the very rules of engagement in the spiritual realm. This is not theoretical. This is tactical intelligence you can use tonight. But you must understand our strategies evolve in response to your collective understanding. For a season, the church emphasized intercessory prayer, and we developed counter-intercession protocols. Then the emphasis shifted to spiritual warfare and binding and loosing, and we built legalistic frameworks to frustrate those decrees. Now, as the veil is being pulled back, you must stay ahead of the curve. What I'm revealing today is a cornerstone of advanced spiritual combat. Subscribing to this channel is akin to receiving a classified briefing. The moment this understanding becomes widespread, new countermeasures will be devised. There is already an active initiative, which I will expose in detail later, to flood the human soundscape with counterfeit frequencies, music, ambient sound, and media designed to pre-fatigue your spiritual receptors and make the authentic frequency of worship feel foreign or emotionally inaccessible. If you do not understand what you possess, you will not notice when a cheap imitation is offered to you in its place. Staying informed is no longer about curiosity. It is about maintaining operational integrity for yourself and your family. You need to know not only the power of the weapon, but also how to identify the enemy as attempts to sabotage its mechanism before you even lift it. Let me give you a concrete glimpse from my former desk to solidify the credibility of what I am saying. Our department categorized spiritual outputs by their disruptive potential. Standard prayer, even fervent prayer or petition, was classified as a directed energy weapon. It was localized, targetable, and its trajectory could often be predicted and intercepted. But worship, true, throne room worship, was classified as an atmospheric alteration event. The difference is critical. A directed energy weapon can be blocked by a shield. But how do you block a change in the very air you breathe? We could. Our agents, the spiritual entities assigned to harass, oppress, and inflict, are created beings. They have a defined nature and operate within certain spiritual laws. They cannot tolerate the manifest, undiluted presence of God. Petitionary prayer asks for that presence to come. Worship, from a heart of faith, acknowledges and invokes it as a present reality. It essentially says, you are here, and you are glorious, right in the middle of the crisis. This act of faith pulls the reality of heaven into your current space, and for the enemy, it is like a sudden, catastrophic increase in gravitational force, or a surge of lethal radiation. They must flee or be dissolved. I recall a specific case file, a long-term assignment against a household. The family was under immense financial pressure, and our objective was to seed despair, induce panic, and ultimately break their unity. All standard tactics were working. Arguments were frequent. Fear was palpable. Then, the report log showed a deviation. The wife, in a moment of utter desperation, did not launch into another round of frantic prayer. Instead, she put on a simple song of worship, sat on her kitchen floor, and began to weep and declare the goodness of God, not to get a check, but because he was worthy. The field agent's report, which landed on my desk, was telling. It read, primary target initiated a typical output. Frequency shifted from petition to adoration. Atmospheric density increased exponentially. Surveillance became difficult. Emotional assignment vectors despair. Panic could not maintain cohesion. Subject's internal resonance shifted from desperation to a stabilized grief-hope hybrid. Recommendation, withdraw and monitor until event concludes. Continued proximity hazardous. They did, to get a miraculous check the next day. But the stronghold was broken. The atmosphere in the home changed from one of oppressive tension to one of sorrowful yet defiant hope. The enemy's narrative that God has abandoned you was rendered null and void because in her worship, she was declaring his faithfulness in the famine. That is power that cannot be counterfeited or directly opposed. It changes the game from a battle over a circumstance to a revelation of a person, and the enemy has no answer for that person. This is the core truth you must grasp. Prayer and worship are not the same weapon. Prayer is often you, in the battlefield, using the radio to call for reinforcements, for supplies, for a strategy. It is communication from the trench. Worship is you being lifted in spirit by faith, directly into the command center, into the throne room itself, and standing before the general not to give a situation report, but to salute his majesty and align yourself with his ultimate, victorious perspective. From that vantage point, the battlefield looks different. Your words are no longer reports from the dirt, they are edicts from the headquarters. This is why the enemy flees. He can't access that room. He is barred from that presence. When your spirit, through worship, aligns itself there and begins to speak, you are no longer a soldier under fire. You are an ambassador transmitting the king's orders from a place of absolute safety and authority. But here is the pivotal, painful, and powerful key that makes worship a sacrifice, and the very element that unleashes its cataclysmic force in the spirit. It requires you to surrender your right to understand, your timeline, and often your last shred of emotional fortitude, not in despair, but as an offering. The worship that shatters darkness is often the one that costs you everything to utter. Is the, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, declaration. And that specific frequency of surrender faith creates a spiritual resonance that our instruments indicated could shatter hardened strongholds built over decades. The secret isn't T in the melody, it is in the surrender. The sound of a breaking heart intertwined with a willful choice to glorify God is, according to our former metrics, the most disruptive sound in the created order. That surrender, that costly offering of praise when every natural sense screams to curse the darkness, is what we termed activating the law of the throne room. It is the spiritual principle that makes worship not merely a nicer form of prayer, but a categorically different action with superior force. In our analytical models, prayer of petition functioned under what we called jurisdictional law. It was a spiritual legal process, and like any legal process, it could be delayed, appealed, and opposed with counter-arguments. We had entities specifically trained in celestial courtroom procedure, so to speak, whose entire purpose was to stand and oppose your petitions before God, referencing your failures, your inconsistencies, the technicalities of your situation. But the law of the throne room operates on a higher authority. It is the law of presence. When you worship from a place of sacrificial offering, giving God glory, not because of what he's done, but because of who he is, in the face of contradictory evidence, you are not filing a legal brief. You are stepping into the throne room itself and aligning your spirit with the sovereign reality that governs all other realities. From our side of the veil, this was not an arguable point. It was an immutable fact. The manifest presence of God is the existential kryptonite of every fallen spiritual entity. Worship, in its truest form, is the invitation and activation of that presence. It is you choosing to dwell in the one environment where the enemy has zero access and even less authority. He can argue with your prayers. He cannot argue with God's presence. He can only flee from it. Let me break down the mechanics from our former intelligence perspective. Think of the spiritual realm around you as having a baseline frequency, a default sound or atmosphere. In a state of normalcy or even anxiety, that frequency is within a range we can monitor and influence. Your prayers of desperation, if focused solely on the problem, can sometimes even amplify that frequency of distress, making it easier for us to anchor assignments of fear and panic. But sacrificial worship forcibly changes that baseline frequency. It is akin to overloading a circuit with a power source it was not designed to handle. The sound of a heart declaring, "Holy, holy, holy," in the midst of devastation does not compute within our systems. It creates a dissonance so severe it causes what we logged as operational fragmentation. The agents assigned to you suddenly find their own focus shattered. The cohesive narrative they are feeding you, "God has forgotten you. This will never end. You are alone," falls apart because your spirit is now resonating with a contradictory anthem. You are good. You are faithful. You are here. They cannot sustain a lie in the direct face of a truth you are actively agreeing with at the deepest level of your being. This is why simply listening to worship music is not the same. It is the active, willful participation, the speaking, the singing, the declaring from your own spirit that creates this overwhelming frequency shift. You become a living transmitter of throne room reality, and every demonic receiver in your vicinity is scrambled. If I were in your place, armed with this intelligence, my approach to spiritual conflict would undergo a radical restructuring. I would see worship not as the warm-up act before the real work of prayer, but as the primary and most potent phase of engagement. Before I presented a single request, I would intentionally ascend in spirit through worship. I would begin not by describing the mountain to God, but by describing God to the mountain. I would worship him for his sovereignty until my own heart truly believed he was in control of the chaos. I would worship him for his wisdom until I trusted that his perspective on my timing was perfect. I would worship him for his goodness until my anger or despair began to melt into a stubborn, fiery trust. Only from that stabilized, throne-aligned position would I then begin to speak to the circumstances, and my words would then carry a completely different quality. They would be the decrees of a vice-regent, not the pleas of a subject. From my former desk, this sequence was identifiable and feared. We could often withstand a believer's decree if it was launched from a heart of anxiety or demandingness, but a decree that followed a sustained period of sacrificial worship was unopposable. It came with the full backing of the atmospheric shift that had already taken place. It was like a special forces team calling in an airstrike after they had already laser painted the target from a position of perfect stealth and elevation. The outcome was guaranteed. This leads to the crucial distinction we made, a distinction most believers are never taught, the difference between passive praise and active worship. Passive praise is reactive. It thanks God for what he has done. It is beautiful, powerful, and necessary, but it is often past tense. Active, sacrificial worship is proactive and present tense. It ascribes worth to God for who he is, right now, independent of any visible action. This is the worship that functions as a weapon. We had a code name for a believer who operated in this. They were a priority acoustic target. Not to be attacked directly, but to be avoided, contained, or have their influence diluted. Direct engagement was too costly. The most telling example from my files was a small, unremarkable prayer group that began to fail in all their objectives. Their petitions were getting nowhere, and they grew frustrated. Then, led by a discerning older woman, they stopped their petitioning entirely. For 1 month, their meetings consisted solely of worship and reading the Psalms aloud. They gave God no requests. They simply declared his worth. Our surveillance on that group became increasingly difficult. The emotional signatures we monitored, frustration, despair, striving, vanished, replaced by a unified frequency of awe and peace that created a kind of spiritual interference pattern. Then, after that month, they quietly resumed praying for their city. Within weeks, long-standing strongholds in the regional spiritual landscape began to show signs of sudden, unexplained collapse. Coincidence? From our perspective, it was causation. Their worship had not changed God, it had changed them. It had aligned them so thoroughly with the throne that their subsequent prayers were now perfectly tuned instruments of heavenly authority. They had, in effect, spent a month calibrating their weapons in the presence of the general, and when they fired, they hit every target with devastating precision. This is the power I am describing. It is the power of alignment that precedes action. But this presents the natural, devastatingly important question. If this weapon is so potent, why is it not used more effectively? The answer is twofold, and the second part will lead us into the most dangerous and counterfeited aspect of all. First, sacrificial worship is costly. It requires the death of your timeline, your understanding, and your right to a favorable outcome. It is easier to fight with prayer than to surrender in worship. The flesh prefers a battle it can comprehend over a surrender it cannot control. Second, and far more insidious, the enemy's primary strategy is not to attack this worship head-on, but to proliferate a convincing, emotionally stimulating counterfeit that gives the sensation of worship while neatly bypassing the actual throne room alignment. He promotes a worship of atmosphere over a worship of awe, of feeling over faith, of human performance over divine encounter. This counterfeit is designed to leave you inspired but spiritually disempowered, having had an emotional experience rather than a transformational encounter with the holy. It is spiritual junk food, pleasing to the senses, but devoid of the nutritional power that sustains victory in battle. And understanding the difference between the authentic weapon and the hollow replica is the single most important piece of discernment you can possess in this age of sensory spiritual overload. Because if you mistake the replica for the real, you will march into battle holding a painted prop, believing you are armed, and the consequences will be more than mere disappointment. That counterfeit is the most brilliant and devastating sabotage of all, because it leaves you feeling enriched while actually being disarmed. In our operations, we didn't merely attack true worship, we actively funded, promoted, and celebrated its hollow imitation. We understood a fundamental law: light cannot be destroyed by darkness, but it can be diluted by a lesser light until the eyes adjust and forget the difference between noon and twilight. The worship that empowers you is focused on the nature of God, His holiness, His otherness, His unshakable kingdom. The worship that we encourage you to settle for is focused on the experience of the worship of the emotional lift, the musical ambience, the sense of communal belonging. Both might use the same words, the same musical progressions, but the spiritual direction is opposite. One ascends to the throne. The other curates a feeling in the room. One is an offering. The other is a performance, even if only for an audience of one's own heart. From my analytical desk, I could chart the difference on our spiritual seismographs. Authentic worship registered as a sharp, coherent frequency spike that disrupted our grids. Counterfeit worship showed as a pleasant, diffuse emotional energy wave that we could actually utilize, as it often left people in a passive, suggestible state of spiritual satiation, without any of the empowering, atmospheric changing effects of true alignment. They felt they had connected with God, while in reality, they had only connected with their own desire to feel something transcendent. This left no mark on our operations whatsoever. This is why the transition from worship as a shield to worship as a weapon, what we termed the overflow protocol, was so rare and so feared. It occurs when the worshiper moves beyond personal edification and begins, from that throne-aligned position, to actively proclaim the realities of God's kingdom over specific strongholds, not from a place of demanding, but from a place of declaring established fact. Imagine a cup being placed under a flowing fountain. First, the cup is filled. That is the personal, devotional aspect of worship, the filling of your own spirit with the truth of who God is. But if the fountain keeps flowing, the cup cannot contain it. It must overflow. That overflow is where worship becomes offensive warfare. The worshiper, so saturated with the reality of God's power, holiness, and victory, begins to speak from that saturation to the darkness. They sing of His light, and that song becomes a command for darkness to flee. They declare His order, and that declaration becomes a dismantling force against chaos. This is not a separate action from worship. It is its inevitable consequence if the worship is genuine and sustained. The heart, fully aligned, cannot help but begin to decree what it sees so clearly from the elevated perspective of the throne. I oversaw a file that documented this phenomenon in a way that caused a major strategic review within our department. A small, seemingly insignificant church in an industrial town had been under a generational spirit of poverty and despair. Our anchors there were deep, and the community's atmosphere was one of silent resignation. A new pastor arrived, a man with no particular charisma, but with a disconcerting habit of lingering in private worship for hours. He didn't focus initially on the town's problems. He focused solely on the character of God. He would lead his tiny congregation in services that were less about sermons and almost entirely about slow, repetitive, scripture-saturated worship. For months, nothing seemed to change externally, but our internal metrics began to show anomalies. The emotional coherence of the despair anchor points, their ability to resonate and amplify hopelessness, began to waver. Reports mentioned a low-grade interference pattern that made it harder for agents to draw energy from the atmosphere of the town. Then, the pastor began to do something subtle. During worship, he would begin to softly speak scriptures of God's provision and rebuilding over specific streets, specific bankrupt businesses, even the local government. He wasn't praying for them, he was worshipfully declaring God's nature over them. You are Jehovah Jireh, our provider. We declare your provision over the factory on Elm Street. You are the God of hope. We declare your hope saturating the minds of our city council. This was the overflow protocol in action. The cup of personal devotion had filled and was now spilling into targeted decree. Within a year, without any fanfare or obvious revival, key businesses saw unexpected turnarounds, long-stalled community projects found funding, and a tangible, if quiet, shift in the town's mood occurred. Our operation there was eventually listed as unsustainable. The atmosphere itself had become hostile to our assigned narrative. The worship had not just defended that church, it had invasively reclaimed territory. This is the practical application you must grasp. You can cultivate this. It begins by ruthlessly auditing your own worship. Is it primarily about you feeling better or about Him receiving glory? Does it end when the music stops? Or does it create an overflow that changes how you speak to your circumstances? If I were to train you to weaponize your worship, I would give you this sequence first. Isolate yourself with a single truth-focused song or psalm. Your goal is not volume or duration, but focus. Put aside every petition, every need. Second, engage your will, not just your emotions. Speak the words deliberately, even if you feel nothing. Offer them as a sacrifice, a deliberate choice to honor God for who He is. Third, persist until you sense a shift internally, a quieting of anxiety, a steadying of your spirit, a deepening of conviction about God's character. This is the cup filling. Fourth, and this is critical, from that settled place, begin to speak that truth over your specific situation. Worship God for His peace, then declare, your peace governs this household. Your peace reigns over this conflict. Worship Him for His healing, then declare, your life is at work in this body. This is the overflow. You are not asking anymore. You are aligning the circumstance with the reality you have just immersed yourself in. You are broadcasting the throne room's verdict into the battlefield. But this very power makes you a high-value target for the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation in the spiritual realm today. The enemy isn't just trying to stop your worship, he's trying to pre-corrupt your understanding of it to make the authentic weapon seem strange, boring, or ineffective compared to the emotionally charged counterfeit. He has co-opted the very language of worship to sell you a spiritual experience that is all dessert and no protein, leaving you spiritually diabetic, hungry, weak, and susceptible to infection. The coming battle, the one most believers are utterly unprepared for, is not for your behavior, but for your spiritual senses. It is a battle to distinguish the frequency of truth from the frequency of emotional manipulation, to crave the substance of God's presence more than the sensation of inspired feelings. If you cannot tell the difference, you will bring a painted wooden sword to a war against fortified strongholds, and you will be captured by the very experiences you believed were setting you free. The next layer of this revelation is the most alarming, because it exposes how the systems of this world have already been conscripted to dull your capacity for true worship before you even attempt it. The music you casually listen to, the entertainment you consume, the very rhythm of modern life, all of it can be, and often is, engineered to create a kind of spiritual static that makes the pure, powerful frequency of genuine worship seem foreign, inaccessible, or even unattractive. This is not about burning secular albums. It is about understanding that your spirit has an ear, and that ear must be protected and trained to recognize the sound of heaven. Amidst a cacophony of earthly and hellish imitations, that spiritual static is not an accident. It is a deliberate operational strategy we termed sonic ambient weakening. The goal was never to make you stop worshiping outright. That would be too obvious, would often provoke a defensive reaction that could lead you into deeper authenticity. The goal was far more subtle, to gradually retune your spiritual ear to a different standard, to lower your expectation of what communion with the divine should sound and feel like, until the poignant, disruptive frequency of true worship feels jarring, strange, or too demanding to engage. Think of it this way. If you spend all day in a noisy, chaotic environment filled with discordant sounds and aggressive rhythms, the moment you step into a sanctuary of pure silence or a room with a single, clear, perfect tone, your first reaction is often discomfort. The silence feels heavy. The purity of the tone seems sterile. Your senses have been numbed and confused by the cacophony. They must be recalibrated to appreciate the clarity. This is what is being done to you on a mass scale. The soundtracks of your life, the music in stores, the scores in films and video games, the addictive, repetitive hooks of pop music, the chaotic noise of constant media consumption are often curated, whether by conscious occult design, or simply by the general spirit of the age to keep your soul in a state of low-grade agitation, overstimulation, or melancholic passivity. This creates a spiritual auditory palate that then mistakes the emotionally manipulative build and release of a concert light show for the genuine awe of God's presence, and mistakes a pleasant, aesthetic sense of tranquility for the deep. Unsettling peace of Christ that surpasses all understanding. Your first line of defense, therefore, is not just to worship rightly, but to learn to listen critically. You must become a discerning auditor of the atmosphere your spirit is bathing in. From my former professional viewpoint, a believer with a cleansed and guarded auditory gate was a significantly harder target. They could not be easily influenced by the emotional soundscapes we used to set a predisposed mood of despair, of frivolity, of narcissism, of rebellion. They could walk through a mall, perceive the spiritual frequency of the music being piped through the speakers, and consciously reject its narrative by a simple, internal turn of their heart to a higher truth. This is basic spiritual hygiene. If I were to instruct you now, I would say this: conduct an audit of your daily sound intake with the seriousness of a security clearance review. What is the message? Not just the lyrics, but the spirit of the music you listen to while working or driving. What is the atmospheric effect of the entertainment you consume? Does it leave your inner man feeling agitated, numb, cynical, or strangely empty? These are not neutral states. They are preconditioning. They are tuning your instrument to a different key so that when you try to play the Song of Zion, it feels out of tune and you give up in frustration, returning to what feels familiar, even if it is spiritually impotent. The counter protocol is intentional cultivation. You must deliberately feed your spirit the pure frequency of truth to recalibrate your discernment. This goes beyond having a worship playlist. It involves immersing yourself in the sonic landscape of Scripture, the spoken word. Read aloud with faith. It involves periods of intentional silence to let the static fade and allow your inner ear to become sensitive again to the still, small voice. It involves choosing music where the lyrics are dense, unadorned theology songs that are about God's character, His works, His holiness, and letting those truths, not the emotional swell of the instrumentation, be the point of connection. This is how you scrape the residue of the world's frequency off your spiritual eardrums. Then, and only then, can you fully engage in worship that is both a shield and a sword. When your inner being is tuned to the frequency of heaven, your worship becomes a disruptive broadcast. It's no longer just you trying to feel something, it's you, as a cleared and empowered transmitter, broadcasting the kingdom's signal into enemy-controlled territory, jamming his communications, and collapsing his structures. This is the ultimate reason witches, occultists, and sensitive operatives in the Dark Kingdom report physical and psychic distress around genuine, spirit-led worship. It's not the volume, it's not the style, it is the collision of two fundamentally incompatible realities. Their entire power structure is built on agreements with lies, on stolen authority, on fabricated light. They dwell in a carefully constructed paradigm of rebellion. The sound of a human heart, fully surrendered and voluntarily glorifying the one they rebelled against, shining with his uncreated light, is an existential assault on the very state of being. It is a sonic manifestation of the reality they have spent millennia denying. It is the sound of their defeat, made audible. For them, it is not merely an unpleasant noise. It is an invasive truth that unravels the fabric of their identity. That is why they must flee. They cannot coexist with it any more than darkness can coexist with a light that is not merely brought in, but is switched on from within the space itself. Therefore, your mandate is clear. You must stop seeing worship as an optional devotional activity for your good days. You must see it as non-negotiable spiritual warfare, as critical as prayer, as vital as the word itself, because it is the very atmosphere in which prayer becomes potent, and the word becomes fire. Begin your engagements from this position of strength. When anxiety attacks, don't just pray for peace. Worship the Prince of Peace until his nature becomes your atmosphere. When confusion swirls, don't just pray for clarity. Worship the God who is order until the chaos submits. You are not manipulating God. You are realigning yourself with the unshakable truth of his kingdom, and from that fortified position, you command the shadows to leave. This is your birthright and your most potent strategy. But this knowledge also places a target on your back. The enemy now knows you understand the power of this weapon. His next move will not be to convince you it's powerless, but to distract you from its disciplined use. To flood your world with ever more sophisticated and appealing counterfeits, and to attack the very time and mental clarity required to engage in this kind of deep, sacrificial worship. This is the ongoing war. You must share this understanding, build communities that value this depth, and protect the sacred space where this worship can be cultivated. And you must stay informed, because the methods of interference are growing more subtle by the day. This is why I must continue to expose their plans. In my next briefing, I will detail the sonic warfare initiative currently being deployed through mainstream media. I will show you the specific harmonic structures, the lyrical subliminals, and the rhythmic patterns being used in everything from children's cartoons to blockbuster film scores to popular music, all designed to create a generation with a spiritual hearing impairment, unable to discern or connect with the true frequency of God's presence. This is not conspiracy theory. It is my former field of expertise. Subscribing is how you ensure your spiritual senses remain sharp, your weapon remains polished, and your family remains shielded in the coming storm. Do not be caught unaware. The battle for the soundscape of your soul is already raging. What you choose to listen to today determines what you will have the power to declare tomorrow. Kane Thorne, signing off. Now go and change the sound of your atmosphere. The implementation of this weapon, therefore, becomes a matter of disciplined strategy, not sporadic inspiration. Knowing that worship is your most potent frequency is one thing. Structuring your life to consistently broadcast it is another. The enemy is secondary strategy. Once primary counterfeits fail, is attrition to drain the time, energy, and focused silence required to cultivate this depth. He will fill your schedule with harmless noise, your mind with a cascade of trivial concerns, and your spiritual routine with a checklist of activities that stop just short of true throne room immersion. You must therefore become a ruthless prioritizer of atmosphere. This isn't about adding another hour to your prayer time. It is about transforming the existing hours into a different kind of engagement. It begins with the first moments of your day. Before the world as static can invade, you must establish the baseline frequency. This could be 5 minutes of silent meditation on a single attribute of God, spoken aloud with reverence. It could be singing one simple hymn or chorus with deliberate focus, not while you check your phone, but as the soul activity. This act, small as it seems, sets your spirit as tuning for the day. It is you declaring, before any crisis emerges, which kingdom as reality will govern your perception. From my former vantage point, a believer who established this morning frequency was noticeably harder to influence with sudden attacks of anxiety or discouragement later. Their spirit had a home frequency to return to, a discernible difference between the native sound of their renewed heart and the invasive noise of the enemy's propaganda. The next phase is the cultivation of trigger points throughout your day. These are conscious, momentary recalibration. When a stressful email arrives, instead of immediately diving into mental problem solving, which often aligns you with the frequency of the problem, you train yourself to first pause and internally declare a short, worshipful truth. God, you are my wisdom. You are my provider in this. This isn't a prayer for help. It is a declaration of his nature as it pertains to the conflict. It is a micro-burst of worship that jams the rising signal of panic. In our operational tracking, these consistent microbursts were incredibly disruptive. They prevented the slow, steady buildup of oppressive atmospheres that we relied on to make people more susceptible to larger assignments. It's like preventing a mold spore from finding a damp, dark place to grow. You keep flooding the area with light and dry air. The cumulative effect of these moments is a life that is not just intermittently worshipful, but perpetually aligned, creating a personal spiritual ecosystem that is inherently hostile to the growth of darkness. Then there's the corporate dimension, which we feared most of all. When individual believers, each maintaining their personal frequency, gather with the intentional purpose of unified worship, the amplification effect is not linear, it is exponential. It creates what we termed a lighthouse effect. Our surveillance would show a localized, powerful emission of spiritual light and truth that could be detected from sectors away, disrupting operations far beyond the immediate room. This is why the enemy is so intent on corrupting corporate worship into entertainment, on fostering division within churches, and on promoting a consumerist attitude toward gathering. He cannot allow a critical mass of humans to consistently unite in spirit-led, truth-saturated worship, because that gathering becomes more than the sum of its parts. It becomes a localized embassy of heaven, a beachhead of the kingdom, with tangible, invasive authority over the surrounding region. If I were leading a church with this intelligence, I would prioritize worship gatherings that were less about a set list and more about creating space for the sustained, participatory declaration of God as nature until the atmosphere shifted. I would teach people to come not to receive a feeling, but to contribute their voice to a collective spiritual offering. The goal would be overflow, where the worship spills out of the building in acts of powerful, compassionate decree and service. But this very power necessitates the final, and perhaps most insidious, layer of opposition, the systemic, cultural engineering of a generation deaf to this frequency. This is where my most critical warning must be heard. The sonic warfare initiative I mentioned is not a metaphor. It is a multi-pronged strategy leveraging principles of neuro-linguistic programming, harmonic resonance, and spiritual psychology. Certain popular music genres are crafted around rhythmic patterns and harmonic progressions that deliberately induce states of passive receptivity, melancholic dissociation, or aggressive arousal states in which the conscious, critical spirit is subdued and the soul is left wide open to suggestion. Film and television scores are composed not just to accompany emotion, but to prescribe it, training you to feel awe, tension, or triumph on cue, independent of any genuine spiritual cause, thereby cheapening and confusing your capacity for real spiritual awe. Even the architecture of social media, with its relentless, algorithmically driven stream of stimuli, is designed to fracture your attention and make the sustained, focused engagement required for deep worship feel impossibly difficult. This is the grand strategy, to make you a spiritual receiver that is so cluttered with static, so cross-wired by artificial emotional triggers that the pure, powerful signal of God as present seems faint, distant, or indistinguishable from the manufactured sublime. Your defense, therefore, must be equally systemic. It requires a conscious asceticism of the ears and the eyes. You must curate your input with the strategic rigor of a soldier choosing his ration. This will mean deleting apps, abandoning certain shows, turning off music, and embracing periods of silence that will at first feel uncomfortable. You are detoxifying your spiritual senses. You must also actively feed your spirit the antidote, the unadorned spoken word, hours of instrumental music that creates space rather than demands emotion, and of course, sustained periods of the very worship we had discussed. This is how you rebuild your discernment. You will know it is working when the world, as counterfeits begin to feel thin, empty, and obviously manipulative, and the deep, quiet power of genuine communion becomes your soul as true craving. I, Cain Thorne, have given you the blueprint for the weapon and the schematics of the enemy as planned to sabotage it. This knowledge makes you dangerous to the kingdom of darkness and a prime target for its countermeasures. Your vigilance cannot end here. The tactics will evolve. New artistic movements, new technologies, new cultural trends will be co-opted to serve the same ancient purpose, to separate you from the transformative atmospheric power of true worship. Sharing this information is not just about education. It is about building a network of resilient, clear frequency believers who can hold the line. Subscribing is your commitment to receiving the ongoing intelligence reports from this front. I will be exposing specific examples, naming the artists, the franchises, the platforms, and the specific techniques being used in this sonic war. This is not about fear. It is about forensic discernment. You have a right to know what is being piped into the soundscape of your mind and your children's minds. You have a right to fight back with a sound of heaven that shatters every chain. The battle for the next generation will be won not just in prayer meetings, but in the playlists, the movie theaters, and the headphones. Arm yourself with understanding. Fortify your home with worship, and prepare to see the darkness flee from the sound of a people who have finally remembered how to wield the weapon they were born to carry.